Welcome to Pod Breaks Africa, the sweet and sour bits of passion, where we interview African podcasters sharing their experiences, including successes, challenges, and failures, providing knowledge for budding African creatives who have chosen the spark and want to invest in their passion.
Today is going to be an engaging, interactive session, and today we'll be digging deep into the essential elements that makes a podcast truly exceptional. My name is Guinevere, and my co-host is Favor Uchenna, and we have a guest speaker in the house who's going to touch on the subject and share his expertise on the subject. His name is Rodney Omeokachie. I hope I got that. And from the captivating storytelling to the your effective editing techniques, or what you need to do to make your podcast great, we're going to explore the key factors that set great podcasts apart from the rest. Okay, so it doesn't matter your journey on the podcast, on your podcast journey or the podcast industry. It doesn't matter where you are, beginner or dreamer or advanced intermediate. Whatever knowledge you gain from here, you can apply to what you have and advance your creativity on your journey to get your podcast great and impactful. So let's talk about Rodney a little bit. I was debriefed like a CIA agent on who our guest speaker is today. He's a multi-award winner podcaster and creator of the Young God podcast. If you've not listened to it, I beg you to do that, because you're going to be amazed at the creativity he pours out there. He has a thriving podcast that have captivated audiences around the world, not just Africa. So that's why he's here to share his tricks, tips, and his mistakes that you should not make them as well on your journey, so you can be greater, because we are always aspiring to have our students better than the masters or their teachers. Okay, so that's all the debrief I had about Rodney. I'm going to let him, we're going to dive into his story to get to know him, his journey, how he started, why he started, and for us to learn about his journey and the tactics he used to get him to the point where he is today. All right. So, guys, like I said, this is not just a show or a podcast for us to talk. It's also a learning curve. So by the end of this session, I would really love you to have a pen or a paper, but would like to know that you understand the fundamental principles of creating engaging podcast content. By the end of this session, you should be able to get some principles you can apply to your podcast and learn from them. You should be able to learn how to develop a unique and compelling podcast style. Okay? And it's okay to have trial and errors. That's where the beauty of creativity is, because beautiful things are mostly coming from mistakes and errors that we are courageous enough to bring out there. So by the end of this session, or at the end of it, you need to discover the effective techniques for conducting interviews and storytelling. And you should be able to understand how to create loyal listening and gather a fan base of loyal listeners and grow the podcast audience. Gain practical tips and hacks in producing high quality podcast episodes. So these points you should get from this session. And if you're not getting that, feel free to ask questions, tweet at us, and Rodney is happy to share that knowledge. So without any further ado, let's start speaking to our best and most only right now on this show, Rodney. And hey, Rodney, you ready for us?
Yes, I am. Am I audible?
Fantastic. So, you skipped our question before. We'd like to know what you ate today. What do you use, or what do you add to your diet to make you healthy, to think about healthy ideas that make you jump into having the Young God podcast this unique and this fantastic. So let's start with the food.
Okay.
I'm a foodie, by the way.
Oh, you're a foodie. Well, you're going to be very disappointed by my answer.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because my diet is it's very simple, and something that keeps me effective because one of the things about being a creator or a creative is trying to like minimize the amount of decisions you have to make in a day so that you can spend that energy on.
That's amazing. So keeping it simple. So what about your journey? Tell us about your journey. How did you start your journey to becoming a podcaster? I see Rodney is connecting. Can anybody hear me?
Hi, Gwen. Yes, I can hear you. I don't know if anyone else too can hear. Please, if you can hear her, can you send in an emoji? Thank you so much. Amazing. Thank
Yes,
you. Rodney is having
I can.
issues.
Okay,
I can hear
Rodney's
you.
having network issues. But the first thing I gained from the little thing he shared about his food is keeping it simple. So making things simple gives him more time to think about the most complex and most important things that affect his life. On my own, I will interpret that as if I can keep my podcast as simple as possible, so it can be understandable by anybody, no matter how, no matter their educational background. I think that's one thing I gained from his diet. That's why I asked. So tell me, with an emoji, what do you think about the diet and keeping it simple? So you can have time to think about the complex things that matter to you. Do you buy that or no? You can 100% yes, thumbs up or thumbs down or eh. Is that Uche? Is that emoji for eh? I'm not sure.
I think there is. I
Oh
think
yeah.
there is.
Okay. So I think Rodney's back now.
Yes, I am. Am I audible?
Yes, you are, sir. You can go on.
Yes, you are.
Yes. So thank you, Guinevere, Favor, and Grace of APVA for having me to putting this together. So as I was saying before, the network really interrupted my train of thought. I was just saying that I started podcasting to promote my business in 2017, 2018 actually, and I wanted to reach international clients. So at the time, knowing that podcasts were not mainstream in Nigeria, I don't know if anyone can remember what that was like. 2018 podcasts hadn't become a thing yet.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, that's true.
internationally, podcasts were, a daily routine for millions of people. So I figured that starting a podcast, to promote my business would get me access to that. So after doing it for about a year or so, about 2 seasons, the podcast was called The Creative Habit. Some of you may be familiar with that aspect of my journey. But after doing that for like a season, 6, 8 months, I decided that I could do more with this podcast space. I had a flair for it. It came easily to me. I had the skills at my fingertips, and I just needed to figure out the right concepts, the right packaging, the right branding to make it a podcast worth listening to. And that's when the Young God was born. It's been 6, 7 years of podcast perfection. That's my story in a nutshell.
That's amazing. So basically, you're inspired to jump on the journey of podcasting because you wanted to grow your business.
Yeah, I said I wanted to do my business, and then I just realized that I had more. That there were some things that only I could speak on in the way I can speak on it. That people needed young people specifically needed a voice that spoke to their issues and offered solutions, and not just like um, just and you know content without any dietary fiber, if I can put it like that. And so I said I
Oh,
wanted to create a podcast that was different, that was um, on unignorable, and would also be very, very impactful. And that has been the north star of my podcast journey ever since. So it's no longer about making money or getting a client, even though the podcast since then has done that for me in bunches. But the main thing is, became to start conversations that no one is having, to offer solutions, and to be a voice for our generation.
amazing. That's absolutely amazing. And while you were talking, you touched on the reasons and the motivation behind the podcast, and something jumped at me because you said you're trying to create a podcast that is going to be engaging and impactful, paraphrasing the words you used. What factors were you looking at in trying to achieve that for the podcast you have right now? What were the key factors you're looking at to say, yes, if I have these things checked in my production or the process of creating the podcast, my podcast is going to be outstanding and becoming a voice? What were those key things you are looking at?
So I figured that at the time, again, this is 2017, 2018, 2019 now, when I'm transitioning to the young God. And I'm thinking to myself, if I'm going to do a podcast that is successful, I'm going to have to um, create something that the average Nigerian who doesn't listen to podcasts could not ignore. So I was thinking that way. I know that it's very easy to create for a target audience that wants what you're really doing or is ready for what you have. But how do you connect to people who don't listen to podcasts or who have no reason to tune in when they have music, they have Netflix, they have short form content on TikTok and IG. How do you create something that that would tickle their curiosity, but then also hold them? And so that's where things like the title, for example, was one of the first steps, the cover art, and the kind of risks and creative choices I made with that. And obviously, the type of topics and stories I told, the topics I touched and stories I told, and then the way I now put that all together, all of those sort of informed my decision on how best to put this thing forward that would make sense and would also be sustainable. That's very important. Doing something that you can keep doing, without losing energy, without losing drive, without running out of money, you know, and while also being able to have a full life to do other things, relationships, community, rest. Because podcasting is a full-time job. It feels like a hobby to most people, a podcast, put a mic in your face and you just start. But I considered all these things, and that has sort of been the secret sauce to being consistent, not just putting out episodes, but putting good, high-quality episodes every single day, every single week, year in, year out. So that was my mindset. Luckily for me, I have again a background in branding and strategy and creative endeavors. So it was very, very not easy, but I just knew what to think of. I had the right idea in terms of how to approach it. Like if you're doing anything, whether it's you're building a personal brand or a business brand, or you're trying to market a product or service, all these things I found them transferable to making a podcast, and that has made uh, the journey what it is today.
That's actually quite elaborated. So just quickly summarize the points you pointed out is the elements you're looking at is the packaging of the podcast, the delivery of the podcast, and the content. We can summarize those with those 3 points. Am I correct, Rodney?
Yes, you can.
Okay, fantastic. So our listeners right now can jot that down and check your podcast. If you currently have a podcast, you have to check on your packaging of the podcast, check on your delivery of the podcast, and also check on your content. For example, I have Edgar in the house, who's a listener, and I got to know about Edgar from Instagram and his prank. But what got to me to listen to Edgar is his voice. So that's one thing he used, and the way he delivered his prank. So that's a practical example of the delivery and the content of the podcast. Just trying to give an example so our listeners can get it, because this is actually an educational way for you to get the points, apply them, and so you can be the next APVA best podcaster of the year. in the upcoming awards for 2025. Great. So, Rodney, you said the summary of the key points were the packaging, the delivery, and the content. So, can you walk us through how a person can work on their packaging of their podcast with the bearing in mind that they do not have enough resources or the knowledge you possess, like in branding that you already do? They don't have all those. So how can they put the leg in the door and have a good packaging to help them stand out? Can you walk us through the process you took?
Okay, so I'm going to start from the beginning here. I'm going to say, just acknowledge the fact that everybody and their mother is starting a podcast, and that is great. Like, there's, compared to then, 2018 and now, the podcast space is just buzzing and booming, and there's so many, voices out there. However, it's not enough to simply have something to say or cool friends to banter and vibe with. That's no guarantee that anybody's going to want to listen to you or that you'll be motivated to continue, right? So, from the get go, you have to connect your podcast to something unique about you, something you care about, then create a unique audio experience around that thing that keeps listeners coming back week after week. You're going to need a unique concept, a niche topic, and a well thought out format if you're going to make waves and be successful. So, like I said, your title has to be purposeful and clever. I don't know how many of you have heard of Michelle Obama's new podcast called In My Opinion. What's interesting about that podcast is that a much smaller and obscure podcast by the same title has been complaining that Michelle Obama has come in and stolen their shine. Because now, if you're going to search for In My Opinion, you're going to see Michelle Obama's podcast, and that's going to obviously steal listeners away from you. So that's why that title is very important, because people are kind of lazy in that department. I've seen so many lazy titles that can easily be copied. Well, not copied, but because no one is copying people's titles, but most people think in the same way. So obviously, cultural lingo that is very, mainstream. In my opinion, I said what I said, things like that. These are easy titles that anyone could just, hang on.
Grab.
So a lot of the work is putting your energy into those first few steps of how do I want this podcast to stand out title wise in a way that maybe for the next 5 years you don't have to worry about someone else having the same title as you or like having the same concept as you. And that is how you put your best foot forward. So when you have your title that is purposeful and clever, then your podcast art has to stand out. That's another thing that people also sort of like take the easy way out on. They'll go on Canva, which is cool, and just use a template and create something that just does the job but doesn't like go further in telling a visual story or making a visual promise to a potential listener. If you see a cover and you see a title on a podcast platform, those are the first things that, and this is assuming that you haven't even promoted your podcast to that person. Because most times people go on all these platforms looking for something new. They didn't hear it from you, they didn't hear it from somebody. So Spotify, for example, does a very, very good job of making podcasts discoverable. When you listen to a podcast, right there and then after you're done, they will start to like recommend to you similar podcasts or podcasts you think that you should listen to. And if your title and arts are not giving, you've lost potential listeners, right? So these are the things that one has to take into account before they even hit record. And finally, the actual execution of the concepts, the content itself must be truly, truly creative. It must be more than just an interview or a conversational style concept, which is what most podcasts are. The monologue style that I do is very, very, I won't say difficult, but it is not mainstream. People don't go there because it's very, very hard to, by yourself, carry a podcast for years and years, seasons and episodes by yourself. No leaning on a guest or leaning on a co-host. Just you and your thoughts and your ideas and your vibe. And that is a slept-on format that I would always recommend people to go into if they want to start a podcast today, as opposed to, you know, leaning on guests who may or may not be interesting, who may not be able to express themselves, who may not, and then relying on celebrities is cool, but it's difficult, right? How many celebs want to go on a podcast that is barely, you know, 10 months old or barely 1,000 listeners in? So relying on celebrities for your stuff is also sort of, unless you have that kind of reach and an audience that's already existing, it's always best to just bet on yourself and lean on your personal strengths and your unique value as a creator, as a person. That is what I would say. And like I said in the build up to this live or this space, that for a podcast to be called great, it must do at least two or four things. It must tell people things they didn't know, take people places they haven't been, have a skilled host with a unique strong points of view, and have a unique concept. If you have at least two of these things, your podcast is on the way to success. Honorable mention is great editing and good audio quality. Right, so those things follow after you have those four things. So I'll give an example. I said what I said. How many of us are familiar? Just react via the emojis if you have
Yeah, I have.
listened to I said what I said.
Mhm.
Okay, so I said what I said ticks two of these boxes. That's why it's so successful. It has a unique concept. That agony aunt concept is very, very interesting and very, very relatable. And they have two experienced and relatable hosts with strong points of views. Then they have good audio quality and the editing is decent. So already out of the box, that's a podcast that will be sticky and successful. And I just want to really hone in on this host thing because um, again, everybody thinks they can start a podcast just because they have maybe a nice conversation or whatever. But I would say that one of the things that we find with the best podcasts, with great podcasts, is the host has a distinct personality, and they bring that personality fully to the show. They don't hide, they don't pretend. They're not trying to be something they're not, and it comes easy to them because why? They're already developed as human beings beyond the podcast. They didn't come to the podcast to start to know themselves. They've done things and they've learned things and they've built themselves, whether it's their career or they've lived life in such a way that they have something they can bring to an audience that will just make sense. And so they use their podcast as a channel to express these unique things. Each second of audio is infused with their essence, vibe, and fingerprint, which in turn converts listeners into fans and followers over time. That's influence. People
Yeah,
with personality create podcasts with personality. So you can't create what you don't have.
exactly.
Yeah. And one
That
more thing before I let
okay.
you ask the next question. So the unique concept part of this is another thing that is very slept on. So a good podcast starts with an idea, an original concept, or a compelling angle that you know that no one is exploring. And this gives the podcast personality and texture. Personality and texture means that the host or whoever is editing the podcast, the producer of the podcast, is using the tools of the trade to their full advantage. That's interviews, sounds, and music to create a multi-dimensional listening experience for the audience. And this experience has to be consistent throughout the podcast to bring listeners along, that's across multiple episodes and seasons, and keep them interested in the long term. So, not just one or two episodes, not just viral episodes. And even in the midst of that consistency, there must be elements of surprise and emotional range. So you have to like go beyond one hit of emotion and make the audience feel something, anything, whether it's anger, whether it's happiness, whether it's disgust, whether it's longing. If the audience is not feeling, some emotional provocation from listening to you, they will not tune in. They will not have a reason to tune back in regularly. They will not have that FOMO that is very important in keeping people hooked, right? So you got to keep your audience on their toes so that they never know what to expect. And that's the thing. A lot of podcasts, once they settle into a groove, is very consistent and consistent to the detriment of the podcast. So you have to be consistent as you drop episodes, but the experience must be inconsistent, quote unquote, as in the audience or the listeners, especially those who are regulars, don't know what to expect. Every time they press play, it's like, what is this podcast going to be on today? And so I try to keep that in mind so as to not like have see finish set in and not have a situation where it's easy to compare my podcast with any other. When you tune into to Young God, you know what you're in for, you know what you're here for, you know it's gonna be an experience that you won't get anywhere else. And that is worth its weight in gold if you want to have a great podcast that people, stand and copy and love. Thank
That's
you.
amazing, Rodney. That's really amazing. Rodney has given a lot of information, and I'll just quickly like to summarize some points. So for those who are writing or those who are listening, because you can actually get lost with the explanations given. So I don't want you to get lost because he's pouring out everything, and I need you to get everything from him. So basically, if you're just joining us, thank you so much for joining. The three factors you should look at from our speaker today that he's advising you to get a podcast that stands out is the package, content, and your delivery. And he went further to explain some points. I'm just going to summarize those points that you can use in doing the packaging, content, and delivery. First in the packaging is think about know that the podcast has to start with an idea. Think about it thoroughly. The idea has to be something that no one else is doing, and that's his perspective or the way you're going to do it. It has to be something unique to you, not regular out there, to make it stand out. Remember, the key word is stand out, not blend, because you can do anything everybody is doing and just be one of the crowd. But the talk on today is particularly on standing out. Okay? And when you get the idea, the next thing is to get the name. Do not go for names that can be easily thought out, AI mimicked or something, because there is someone somewhere that can be so wealthy and knock you off the park because they have the money to do the promotions, and then they take your name. It's just going to be a legal battle from there on out. You don't want that stress. The third thing in your packaging is the artwork. So have a catchy artwork. Before you can start talking about your podcast to people, your art should do that for you. If not the art, it should be the title. Something different that someone can't just take it anyway. But if you're having something that's going to become on my chip in here is just go trademark it if you have the money. If you don't, if you're poor folks like a lot of us, now you have to be creative with your name. That's about the packaging. The delivery is the advice that stood out that you should build around on is, as a host of your podcast, you should have a personality. You should not try to find yourself with your podcast. The podcast should find you. People should come to your podcast to experience your personality. Authentic, raw, refined as you grow, but you should have a personality. You can't just go with everything. And that is a delivery. Deliver the content of your podcast in the unique way that is going to be engaging, grabbing. And in your content, you should talk about things that are not commonly accessible. It should not be a bland content that's so rigid on consistency and then loses loses their mark on spontaneity. Okay? So those are the points I have gathered for everybody. If you are following me and if I miss anything, just let me know. You can tweet at me. And if you follow, please, can we see some emojis? And if you understand everything Rodney is trying to explain. Thank you. It's only Grace that's giving me emoji. What's happening? Woman on a mission. Where are you? Abe, Sambaz, T-Code, Emmanuel, Edgar, everybody. Are we all on the same page with Mr. Rodney? Thanks, guys, for the emojis. Okay, so now back to you, Miss. I almost called you Miss Rodney. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Rodney, I almost turned into a woman for a second. Uchenna, help me out here. Okay, so Uche has
In
some
celebration
questions.
of Women's Month, then.
Yeah. Oh
We're
my
all women
God.
today, no Allah.
Oh, awesome. So, Uche, go ahead with some of your questions to Rodney. And while you do that, everybody, I need you guys to tweet at APVA, just at APVA, and give me your perspective on this question. We'll read it out, and Rodney is going to tell us if he concurs or if he has a divergent view. So, where do you draw the line? The public question. So, at APVA, your name and answer the question. Where do you draw the line between consistency and spontaneity on your podcast? How do you strike the balance? What do you think is the best way to do that? Whether you're beginner, intermediate, advanced, just let's hear your perspective on that. And we'll also have Rodney perspective. So tweet at us at Adverb with your answers. We'll read it out, and Rodney will also give us his. But let's go over to my co-host Favor Uchenna to take us along the journey on more questions, and let's dive into the topic. Favor? Thanks. Favor, can you hear us? Ma'am?
Hello. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Favor.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Hello. Okay. I said, can you repeat the question on how to draw the line? The last question you said, you just
Oh,
mentioned right now.
I was talking to the audience. They should tweet at Adverb with their response to the question where to draw the line between consistency and spontaneity when planning on your podcast or your podcast episode or show. So just tweet at us. We'll read it out. Rodney will give his perspective on your answer and also give us his own perspective on the question itself. But now the floor is yours on the questions you have for Rodney, and let's dive into it, Favor. Thank you.
All right. Hello, Rodney. Hi.
Hey,
Okay, so I just have a few questions. I'm trying to be very natural here because my first time. It's my first time on this space, and I've always been a host. So I guess it's one of my first times as an anchor on this space, right? But I've been enjoying every single thing being said, and I would like to say, from everything being said, being unique. I think everything can be summarized on being unique. What's a unique personality one can actually display on their podcast, because that will help to bring in a touch of consistency. Um,
Hi, Rodney. Can you hear me?
yeah, I can hear you.
All
But
right. So I guess she's having network.
okay.
Yeah, you thought you were the only one, right? Me too. I thought I
Yeah.
was the only one. So as we're waiting for her, she was about to ask a question about your personal style. Like, what's your own style? Because I know Rodney. I've known Rodney for a long time. So, like, can you just give us an in-depth to how do you bring up all those ideas, all those your podcast style? How do you think of it? Because I'm sure your personality comes into your podcast every time. I guess that's what she was trying to ask.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Favor's back.
All right. I'm sorry. I don't know where what you heard last. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I was trying to ask what makes a compelling story, and how do you craft engaging narratives for your podcast, right? Talking about your personality, how do you bring up a compelling story? You talked about being able to bring up something that will be able to get audience, people that really don't have interest in podcasts. You said when you started your podcast, how you're able to bring up a context, an idea that people that do not have interest in podcasts can really get interested in. So how are you able to pull that?
So I think one of the things was to understand the podcasting medium and how it's different and special compared to other platforms like maybe YouTube or video, right? And podcasts are really the one of the few story-driven platforms. So you're subscribing to someone's feed to see what the latest thing they're producing is, and you go along with them on that journey, right? Because there's a story that the host or the producer is telling across several episodes. So it's not just a single lonely episode. It's episodes that if you listen to it over a period of time, maybe if you've been listening to a podcast, following them for maybe a season, 10 episodes, you can see the thread that connects each one. That's storytelling in a sense, right? And then you also have to think of the fact that storytelling was originally an oral thing. Storytelling was an audio experience many, many years ago, before now, where there's so many other forms like writing and there's video. Video is fairly new. So when you think of this classic nature of podcasts, you now start to create for the ear. You create for the platform as opposed to recording visuals and calling it a podcast. And you find that you're not really doing anything new because people can just go and watch and listen to your face. If you can watch someone's face, if you can see someone's face, it's not the same as just maybe doing your dishes, you're cooking, you're getting your hair done, and you're just hearing someone's voice and other elements just do its thing in the background. So when you understand how people are going to listen to this thing, you can start to create experiences that fit that, right? So for example, if I say something that I think is a bar or I think is worth hearing again, I know that maybe the audience would want to like rewind 15 seconds or 30 seconds back to get that again. So to help the experience, I would say I would take the initiative and repeat that statement or those words so that they don't have to interrupt their experience and listen back. Obviously, you cannot do that all the time, and you cannot really guess or intuit every single moment that different audiences would feel they need to like rewind and hear something again. But once you pick it, whatever it is that you feel would be that moment, audiences, I've noticed, appreciate when you repeat it for them without making them do that. In fact, they feel like you're in their head. Like, how did you read my mind and know that I wanted to hear that again? So those little details are what make for a very cool storytelling experience. And different hosts, different podcasts, different formats will have different ways of achieving that experience. So it's up to you to really think of podcasts and not as content creation, right? Podcasts aren't content creation. I don't think people think of it as that, as, oh, I'm creating content. Nah, what you're doing with a podcast is, how do I put this? There's a way this has been said before. I said this once, and I'm missing it right now. But podcasts aren't content creation. Podcasts are um, it's an opportunity to share novel ideas and articulate them in such a way that it makes your listeners see the world differently. So great shows make this the north star of every episode. Weak shows published for publishing's sake. How can I say this thing in a way that would help listeners see the world differently? And then that's where it gets into storytelling. That's where it gets into how the words you choose and the way you say them, the way you structure the episodes from the intro to the body to the conclusion, and what happens in between. Like and some of you might be familiar. Sambaza, Grace, and who else here has attended my masterclass? So last year I had a masterclass titled Podcast Intelligence, which is creating a show that is truly a podcast and not just an audio version of a visual content. If that makes sense. Are you with me?
Yeah, we are.
Yes. So keeping these things in mind are the little things that the audience and the listener appreciates. Because first of all, if someone has listened to 100 podcasts in their lifetime, your goal is to find out how can I make this experience different for them. And a lot of podcasts sound the same. A lot of podcasts feel the same. A lot of podcasts, and even if they don't feel the same, they sort of don't have that attention to detail. So you don't expect to just think, they're just talking, let me listen to people talk. So what I try to do is to say, what can I do that would make this experience unique to them that they're like, wow, I haven't heard a podcast like this before. I haven't heard someone say this thing in this way before. I haven't heard this topic explored in this way before. These little things matter in the long term. And it's why someone would share. No one would share a podcast that they've heard 1,000 times. But if you hear something that you've not heard before, you want to put your friend on it. You want to put your family on it. You want to say, hey guys, I just heard this thing. And I want you guys to like see maybe it's just me. And that's what I've found has been a really key ingredient in telling good stories, stories that engage, stories that empower, stories that enlighten. Does that answer your question? Does that answer your question, people?
I think you did. I'm sure she's having some tech issues, and I do apologize about that. On behalf of the network, we're apologizing to all Nigerians that are in the same situations. Okay, thank you, Rodney, on that particular one. But let's quickly go back to some tweets that we already have based on the question that was sent out earlier. And this is coming from Sam Bazer Podcast. His answer to the question, and in case you're just joining us, the question is you can tweet at APVA and give us your answer to the question where to draw the line between consistency and spontaneity on your podcast. This is what Sam Bat's podcast had to say. I draw the line when it's something to do with work-life balance. If I have to give my 100%, I have to be in a good situation rather than give you half of a podcast. That's his response. Rodney, what's your take on that?
He's spot on. He's spot on. I take that into account as well. I don't record when I'm tired. I don't record when I'm not feeling my best because it will affect the editing. If you like what you recorded, you'll be ginger to edit more. To get very creative. But when you recorded with low energy, you're not really in the mood. You're stuttering. You're thinking of somebody that not yet paid you what they owe you. All these different things can affect the vibe of your show. So I'm definitely with some bad on that.
Fantastic. So we have a tweet from Semba Chabi. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Great branding for podcasts is key as it's going to improve the user experience, have great artwork, website, consistent typography, and colors too. Overall, be able to make a memorable impact. If anyone need help branding, always she's offering he she I'm not sure if it's a he she person, but this lady or man is I'm so sorry guys. Semba is offering her service or his service on helping you brand your podcast. So you can just follow at Semba Chabi if you need help with your brand, right? And Sambaza podcast also have this to say: people have to be intentional when they start naming their podcast because that will be a defining factor later on down the line. And that's all the tweets we have so far. Remember, if you want to answer the question how where to draw the line between consistency and spontaneity, please tweet at APVA and give us your feedback. Rodney, so let's come to you. What's your take on that? How, because when you said you answered that people make their podcast bland because they're trying to be consistent. They don't. There's no surprise to the show. They just take a rhythm and stick with it all through to the end. Which is once upon a time it was a good thing, but thereon there came creatives that said we are not part of the box, we are outside of the box. And so they brought spontaneity to their podcast. But where do you think a podcaster should draw the line when it comes to being consistent and being spontaneous on their episodes? Rodney, that's for you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, sir.
Yes. So consistency is good with things like um, how you drop, how often you release episodes. So if you're dropping every week, make it every week. If you're dropping every 2 weeks, drop every 2 weeks. Once a month, drop it once a month. Right? So you have to give yourself and the audience that honor and say, I will show up my audience and not like take a day off unnecessarily. I would make time to record, to edit, to promote. So that's consistency. Like all those things, promoting, creating, and making sure that when they refresh their podcast app with a new episode, when you said there's going to be a new episode. Now with spontaneity, it's more like how each episode how each episode feels. Now obviously, you know, consistency is cool if you're trying to like find a rhythm, find what works. But once you now know what works, you can now start to play and have fun. It's like they say, you learn the rules, and then once you master the rules, you break them. That's the fun of it as a creator and as the audience. You're both on this a relationship, and I think that's how I see it. That makes it so cool for me. I really see it as I'm thinking of my listener of one. This person that's going to listen today. What are we, me and him or me and her, going to like get into? Are they going to disagree with me? Sometimes, I create episodes that they agree with me. So I think to myself, you know what? Let me drop a hot take that's possibly disagreeable, just to spice things up. So things like that. Maybe adding like starting the episode differently. So for example, I would say most episodes start with this: God gang, welcome. That's how I start most of the time. When I'm in the mood, I switch it up and maybe I'll start with a different intro, or I will start with a whole other sound or sound bite, just to like keep the audience on their toes. And then also with topics, it's very rarely, unless I'm doing a series like maybe in the month of February, where I'm exploring like love and relationships. Those 4 episodes in the month of February will be about love. But in general, my topics are very, very, random and well, it's random to the audience, but not to me. So to the audience, they don't know what's next. Today I can talk about money. Tomorrow I can talk about spiritual intelligence. Next, sexual intelligence. Like I go where I want to go creatively, and the audience is just like, what is Rodney gonna say today or talk about today? And that's that spontaneity that is good for building a relationship. Even think about it, even like in life, when you're making friends with people or you're having a relationship that is romantic or whatever, the best relationships are those that you're like, the more you get to know them, the more you fall in love with them, the more you appreciate them, the more you respect them, because they have like this range that keeps the relationship bubbling and blossoming. But once you see finish, whether it's a friend or a lover, the spark is gone, and before you know it, you're making excuses for why you can't see them or talk to them. You're psyching yourself up before you call them because you don't know what you're going to say or what's going to happen or whether you're going to want to be there. So these are the things that you can apply to your podcast to just make it fun for you, because that's also it. Being consistent endlessly is can get boring. It's like, what am I showing up for? Even you, the creator, can lose your steam and fire. But once you have these little things in place for yourself that you don't even know what you're gonna say or how you're gonna say it. Sometimes I have episodes that I look forward to like making because I don't even know what's gonna happen, and then there are others that they are so predictable to me that I just can't wait to get them over with so I can just publish and keep it moving. That's the experience, and that's why spontaneity. That's how spontaneity and consistency sort of like relate.
Balance themselves out. Okay, so that's how they relate. Now, how do you, for a young podcaster who is full of energy and running on creative juice, and they're all over the place with their podcast, and you're told to bring this podcast into decorum because they're all over the place, and they're consistent with their organization but spontaneous with your content and delivery. What would be the first thing you would want to do as a new producer of the show to draw a good, healthy balance between the consistency and the spontaneity of that podcast? And how would you advise any person in that situation to do that?
So there's no one size fits all approach,
Okay.
but this is where we have the line that draws the line between a creative and a creative individual, right? A creative individual, their creativity is not limited to their work. It's not limited to you know making art or making content or whatever. They're creative all day, every day. Like every act, every waking moment is an act of creativity in terms of how they do things, how they approach their life, approach problems, approach um, you know all the different ups and downs of life. So you're a creative individual when you're able to take inspiration from your life and use that to influence your work. Meanwhile, a creative just they work they're only creative when they're doing the work, when they're creating the art or the content. They're only creative when someone has paid them to do it. They're only creative when it's an obvious creative outlet. You get. So this is something that you can't teach, but you can only just say this is the distinction between a creative and a creative individual. It's now up to them to decide if they want to, make that leap from being simply a creative. Most people are creatives. Very few people are creative individuals all round in their life. And that's what I meant when I said a host with a personality, a host that is a creative individual, really takes a podcast to the next level, because then they can really like take those risks that are necessary to make a podcast grow and stand out.
That's quite an interesting perspective on that. So I have a challenging question for you with a scenario painting. Basically, this person has no personality for a podcast. They don't have a voice. They are agreeable to anything that comes around, but they want to start a podcast. They have a good name. They have maybe they tell you what they want to talk about on the show is anything and everything possible. But they start and they have no personality. everything changes every time. They pander to whatever it is that suits their palate at a certain time. What would be your professional intake with that kind of a podcaster and their podcast in the next few months or years? Do you see that as something that can thrive? Would there be audience that would key into people that don't have a personality? Do we have a lot of people on earth without personalities? That's one question. Would they be able to get a following? And what's your professional opinion if someone is taking or towing the part of, this is me, this is my podcast, I don't have a personality, I don't really know what I like or what I don't like, I want to try everything? What's your opinion about that? Because based on what you've said so far, that is a disaster waiting to happen. But if someone's already doing that and you're here listening to you, what is your professional take on that aspect, Rodney?
My professional take is that the beautiful thing about creating is that it's not just about what you create, but it's also about what you become in the process of creating that thing. So it's possible that this person with no personality, as they take on this journey of becoming a podcast and becoming a podcaster and growing their podcast, which is a 24-hour, 24/7 job, you could develop something like you can unlock more of yourself in the process of trying this thing and doing this thing. You can develop that personality and that, source over time, for sure. It's just a matter of, can they stick it out? Because it's not going to be a 1 day thing or a 2 week thing or a 2 month thing. It takes time. So can that person stick to this thing long enough for it to show them who they are, for it to develop into something? That's the question. And only them can answer it.
Okay, that is great. Thank you so much, Rodney, for this insight. But we'll take one more question from you, and then your final words and advice on podcasters. But if you have any question for Rodney, please can you just tweet at APVA and give your questions so he can address that before we call it a close for today. But just to quickly go over the details of the things he has shared and how he shared on making your podcast stand out is the package, content, and your delivery. And one summary on drawing the line between consistency and spontaneity on your podcast is you can be consistent with the organization of your podcast. You can be spontaneous with the delivery of your content on the podcast. So try to find a work-life balance as well by pursuing your passions, because only a healthy brain can think healthy things. Okay? So last question for Mr. Rodney, right? Can you give us some tips and tricks that can be actively applied to an existing podcast or a podcast that's yet to start, but when it starts, they'll become existent, on how to grow a loyal fan listening base for their podcast? Like 4 points on that.
I know that there are different kinds of. Okay, you know what? I'll say this. If you want to, gain the most fulfillment out of your podcast while boosting, downloads, right? And maybe even sales if you're using your podcast for your business, right? Is to publish solo episodes. I can't stress that enough. People don't know this, especially people that are starting out podcasts. They don't know that you don't have to do interviews. Like, podcasts are not interviews. And that misconception is why so many mediocre hour-long interview shows exist. Your podcast content can be anything that delivers value to your listeners. And still, many newbie podcasters default to doing an interview show. Like, think of it like this. You all have unique skills and talents, but I'm willing to bet that interviewing is not one of the best skills. So in all things, focus on your strengths and skills, the things that come easy to you. Create a podcast where you can share your unique expertise. You know, again, most podcasters are average interviewers, but they are above average at whatever their podcast is about. So for this reason, solo episodes outperform episodes on my podcast even. Like guest episodes take a while to reach, let's say, 1,000 downloads compared to when it's just me, right? Um, and it's very simple. When you publish a solo episode, you're delivering explicit value, which means you say, "Here's what I'm going to share today," and you share it. Boom, no fluff. But with guests, with interviews, those episodes tend to contain so much fluff, and to me it's more like implicit value, like it's implied value. It's like listen to these smart people talk and maybe you will pick up something that's useful to you. But with a solo episode, you're giving it to them straight, and that's more valuable to a listener. The second thing I'll say is that listeners subscribe because they love the host. They come for the topic, but they stay for the host. You know, so you know interviews are all about the guests, which makes growth slow unless you have celebrities as guests. But solo episodes are opportunities to like build deeper relationships with your listener of one by sharing your personality, your interests, and your story. And they will connect and become your biggest allies. Another thing is solo episodes are usually shorter. Usually. So they deliver value because it's how do I put this? Gosh, I'm losing my train of thought. Okay. So not only are solo episodes more value packed, but they deliver more value in less time. So let's say an episode is like 15 to 20 minutes long or 30 minutes long. That's value that you can get from minute 1 to minute 20 or minute 30. So if you have a guest or a co-host, there's at least 30 minutes, sometimes 45 minutes that is zero value, just preamble and fluff. And most listeners who value their time will not stay for that. There are things that they are faster to make, right? With guests, you have to find the guest, invite the guest, research the guest, prepare for the guest, then interview, when it's scheduled, which is maybe 1 to 1.5 hours, 1 to 1, almost 3 hours sometimes of conversation. Then you have to edit down to the good parts before you publish. Then after you publish, you now have to like ask the guests to share, which can sometimes feel like you're disturbing them. You ask them to share this thing that you have made. But with solo episodes, it's so fast. You just figure out what you want to say, record yourself saying it, edit, and you publish. That's it, right? So these are the things I want people to think of. The only thing is that people don't trust themselves enough as individuals to carry a show on their own. They don't believe that what they have to say has weight enough. They feel like you need to like bounce off a co-host or have guests to like, take attention away from them. Maybe they don't like to be center of attention. Whatever it is, I feel like doing episodes on your own is a thing that if more people did it, they will get more value for themselves and give more value to their audiences. And most importantly, you will find out what you're made of. Because making an episode by yourself is like self-development without reading self-development books. It's just you one-on-one against you versus yourself. You're looking at your ideas because no one can disagree with you and no one can agree with you. It's either you believe what you're saying or you don't. And most people don't believe what they're saying.
Yeah.
And they don't want to be dragged or cancelled. They don't want, they don't really trust in the validity of their ideas. And who wants to listen to somebody that does not have a strong point of view, who does not like have a thought out, idea? And that's the thing, you have to have a well thought out solo episode. You can't shortchange the audience. You can't, pretend. You have to know what you're saying. And most people don't want to do that extra research. They don't want to put themselves in the line of fire. And that takes away from the potential of what they could really do. That's what I would say for now. I hope that makes someone here like. And so if you're on this group now and you have a co-host or you have a podcast that relies on conversations with multiple people, that's cool. That's not to shoot it down at all. Those can be really good if well done, and they can be really well done. But also, it's like that continuity we talked about. If you usually do guest or co-hosted episodes, put yourself in the line of fire once in a while. Go as it alone. Pick something that you're passionate about, something that you're an expert on, and just like shake tables and see what happens. And I promise you, once that bug bites you and you enjoy it, you'll never go back.
That's amazing. I would add this while you're trying to shake tables. Please make sure you have a stool close by, so in case the table actually breaks, you don't fall to the ground. You fall on your stool. Okay. Thank you.
Tell them.
Thank you so much, Rodney. It has been an amazing discussion with you today. Thank you, everybody, for joining this today's episode on Pod Breaks with APVA on this space. Thank you so much for those who have followed APVA and that followed me. Thank you, Edgar. Oh my God. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sambaz, and everyone that stayed consistent. And Rodney, I followed you. Thank you so much. You've been amazing. So there's some points I wrote on as he was saying, the 4 points that I think everybody should have in their head. It says podcasts are not interviews. Yes, yes, yes. I can't express that enough. Nigerians, Africans, please do not just take what you see on the global space and throw it down here and say it's a standard. Global standard is something that is done frequently by people globally. That doesn't make it a standard. It makes it what is commonly done. You can create yours. As long as it's not mediocrity, it's not something that's plagiarism, you can be unique on your own front. So stop pitching, stop trying to look for someone to make you stand out. You're already lovable. You don't just know it. And the next thing he said is share your unique expertise in your podcast. Do more solo episodes. It's okay to do interviews sometimes, but it's okay if your podcast content is all about interviewing people and getting their perspective on issues. If that's your idea, no problem. But do more solo to deliver more value. He also said, be lovable, because his quote, listeners come for the topic, but stay for the host. So if your topic today is great and you're not a lovable person, maybe your voice, your character, your face, or maybe you have just not those faces that are likable. So they won't stay to be a recurring listener. They will just come for the particular topic they feel rests with them. So to build your followers, go with these tips and catch you on the next episode of Pod Breaks with the next host and the beautiful guests we'll be having. And thank you, everybody, for joining. Grace, we're going to hand over the floor to Miss Grace. Are you there?
Hi, yes, I am.
Thank you. All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in tonight. Thank you, Gwen. Thank you, Rodney. Thank you, Sambasa Podcast. Check Edgar, Oluwaseun, the podcast girl, Semba, Emmanuel, and I can see 2 other listeners. I don't know who is behind the scenes. I can't see you guys. But thank you so much for staying till this time. We really do appreciate you. If you have more suggestions for us at APVA, feel free to share with us. And we will see you in the next episode of Pod Breaks. But before then, we'll be having hangouts with APVA later at the end of this month. I'll be expecting to see you all there. Thank you so much. Have a good night rest. Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Send
Bye. Love you guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Rodney.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Become a member of APVA today. Visit apva.africa to learn more.